So now we will talk about data and policy within Syracuse, New York, in regards to public transportation. So here is a study area map that depicts Syracuse metropolitan area, which is our study area, and this is shown through the Syracuse city shape boundary file. There are other areas outside of Syracuse that are shown on the map, such as Onondaga Lake, Solvay, East Syracuse, Minoa, Fayetteville, and Nedrow. And also within Syracuse, this includes West Side, North Side, East Wood, and South Side. These areas are shown to show whether transportation is provided to areas within Syracuse, but also outside Syracuse to determine whether the connectivity from one place to another exists and whether it is utilized. So here is a map that depicts an income map of Syracuse with a household income of less than 25,000 by census tract. The darker colored tract shows that there are many people that are considered low income, and there's a greater concentration as shown in the center and south of Syracuse. There are also central bus stops that are presented on the map because Syracuse does not have its own subway system. The census tracts with a darker shade have more central bus stops within the center of Syracuse compared to outside of the center of Syracuse, where there is less of a concentration of central bus stops.
And here is the PICS model for the Syracuse metropolitan area. Among the local 20 NAICS industries, the top 5 industries which are greatly impacted by the COVID are accommodation and food services industry, other services industry, wholesale trade industry, arts, entertainment, and recreation industry, and information industry. Except for other services industries, all the other industries are showing decline in location quotient and GDP quotient, which means they are hiring fewer people and experience a decline in economic output during the COVID. There are also industries experiencing a growing trend, such as other services industry and utility industry. But overall, based on the comparison between industrial economic situation points on the graph, the economic conditions of most of Syracuse industries before and during the pandemic were not significantly different. The pandemic doesn't have a huge impact on most local industries of Syracuse.
While we recognize that COVID-19 cannot be the sole explanation for any industrial changes in the Syracuse area, we feel confident in asserting that any industry that significantly departed from its pre-pandemic economic trajectory likely was influenced by the emergence of COVID-19. As a prerequisite to the following data, we found during our research that many values for industries were missing throughout the data set and attempted to estimate those missing values. In finding that some of our initial top 5 industries had the highest amounts of estimations, our final considerations had values within the dataset that had no estimations at all. We felt this would provide more tangible evidence in relation to the report and all consequential recommendations. This table shows the total employment and real GDP change between 2019 and 2020. Significantly, both jobs and GDP were lost between the 2 years and are presented respectively to where they are in the PICS model. The accommodation and food services industry had a significant overall change with a dramatic 25% job loss. This is most likely related to the national reactions to shut down restaurants at the beginning of the pandemic. Other services had a less dramatic loss of jobs and GDP, as did wholesale trade and information. Another large change in employment and GDP was the arts, entertainment, and recreation industry, as most of their events prior to the pandemic were in person. Hollywood, Broadway, and especially small local theaters all shut down, resulting in job losses and economic output. From this graph, we noted that while there was a significant increase in occupations that transitioned to a work-from-home model, most of these industries had already been working remotely, as shown by the 2019 data. The occupation category that nearly doubled in working from home is management, business, science, and arts. We can assume that because the arts and entertainment industry had to begin primarily working from home, this was the cause of the severe increase during the course of the pandemic. We were surprised to find that service, sales, and office occupations did not have as much of an increase in people moving to remote work And in consideration with how many people work in those industries, it can be assumed that everyone who did not move to remote work would be considered essential worker. This bar graph shows that the number of people who utilized public transportation prior to the pandemic were higher overall than mid-pandemic figures, likely due to a combination of switching to remote work or loss of employment. The service occupations group was the only one that increased in use of public transportation commuting during the pandemic. During the first few months of 2020, Centro waived its bus fares, stating that it helped to ease the burden placed on commuting essential workers. This policy may have helped retain some of its ridership loss as a result of public health fears and the increase in remote work for non-essential workers. Additionally, service workers who did not previously use public transit to get to work may have been more motivated to do so without bus fare as a financial barrier. Lastly, a possible shift away from carpooling in order to socially distance oneself may have forced some to public transportation.
So this map represents average commute time and reliance on public transportation from 2019 to 2020. The map representing the 2019 of people who rely on public transportation and the average commute time within Syracuse can be seen on the left. There's a high concentration of multiple darker shades of people who rely on transportation south of Buffalo, while the northeast and west of Buffalo have lighter shade census tracts, which has fewer people that rely on public transportation. Also, there are higher graduated symbols for an average commuting time within all directions of Syracuse. There are a lot more graduated symbols representing 17 to 26 minutes within Syracuse. This also represents that a lot of places within various census tracts of Buffalo require a minimum around 17 minutes in most places to travel to their destination and a maximum time of 26 minutes. And on the right is the 2020 map that also represents public transportation that people rely on and the average commute time. If we compare this to 2019 map for people who rely on public transportation and the average commute time, there was an increase in terms of commute time and the reliance on public transportation. The changes that were shown can be seen west and north of Syracuse, where people rely on public transportation, as there have been changes from a lighter shade to a darker shade based on their census tracts. It shows that people started depending more on public transportation within those areas. In addition, the dependence on public transportation leads to a change in greater commute time, as some of the smaller circles have changed to bigger circles, as you can see from 2019 to the 2020 map. The changes can be correlated with the next visual representation, which will also give insight into why the commute time has increased because of the changes in the central routes. So here we have a 2019 map and 2020 map representing household income, central route, and affordable housing. On the left is the map that represents 2019 household income of less than 25,000, central routes, and affordable housing. Based on the data portrayed on the map, it is unusual, but there is a high concentration of affordable housing shown within the lighter shade of census tracts located southwest. Although there is a higher concentration of affordable housing within the center of Syracuse located within the darker shade of the census tracts, there are a lot of central bus routes located in northwest where there's a lighter shade of low-income census tracts compared to the dark shades of the census tract located southeast. Also, a lot of the central routes do intersect with one another within the center of Syracuse, where it falls within the darker shades of the census tract. And the map on the right depicts a 2020 household income of less than 25,000, the central route, and a housing map, an affordable housing map. The data portrayed on this map displays that affordable housing is highly concentrated within the center of Syracuse, with a few stranded affordable housing points falling outside the center of Syracuse and located within a medium and lighter shade of residents earning less than 25,000. However, there are various amounts of census tracts that have darker shades that have less than 2 points of affordable housing located outside the center of Syracuse. There's a high concentration of residents earning less than 25,000 that is represented by a darker shade within the census tract located at the center, east, and south of Syracuse. In addition, there have been central routes that were suspended that can be seen from the 2019 household income of less than 25,000 central routes and affordable housing map. There are fewer central routes located in northeast and south of Syracuse where there are medium, and darker shades of low income. There's also still a high concentration of central routes located in Northwest and Central Syracuse that overlap census tracts that have a darker shade of low income. So overall, the data collected between both maps, 2019-2020 maps, in regards to a household income of less than 25,000, central route, and housing, affordable housing, have shown changes within the span of a year. There have been central routes changes where multiple lines were suspended during COVID-19 in 2020. As a result, many of these central routes were suspended within medium to darker shade census tracts where there's a high concentration of people who have a household income of less than 25,000. Transit-reliant workers that live outside the center of Syracuse are disproportionately impacted since central routes were cut, affecting their way to travel to their jobs and other destinations. There also isn't much of an alternative method of transit accessibility since Syracuse does not have a subway system. Also, rideshare such as Uber would less likely be around the outskirts of the center of Syracuse, since the areas that have suspended central routes are within the darker shade of low-income census tracts, which would mean that more likely that accessibility to those who live closer to the center of Syracuse would be easier to gain access of, while areas that are profitable with a higher concentration of workers request a ride from rideshares. In addition, this would affect transit-reliant workers within the low-income areas because of the lack of reliability and accessibility to provide options for people to travel from one area to another, which also forces transit-reliant workers to make a choice whether to pay a higher fee than what they would usually pay to commute by taking a rideshare or to become unemployed due to a lack of alternative commuting options.
One significant challenge we encountered with Syracuse is that as a small city, there's very limited data available, both on transit ridership and on the impacts of COVID-19 overall. Whereas in New York and San Francisco, there are already municipal reports, as well as academic research available on the ways the pandemic has affected public transportation and commuting patterns. Syracuse is a bit more elusive. Our understanding of Centro was primarily pieced together using their board meeting minutes, several local news articles, and financial reports from the Syracuse Metropolitan Transportation Council, the presiding MPO. We extensively reviewed relevant planning documents from a variety of local organizations, the majority of which were written before the pandemic, and received little update to reflect the changes that have occurred since 2020. We hope that by examining these regional plans in tandem with our necessarily piecemeal collection of transit data, we can still produce a sufficient narrative of what is taking place in Syracuse and make useful policy recommendations in consequence. While no comprehensive or continuous figures are publicly available on how the bus ridership changed during the pandemic, we did learn that in the weeks immediately after the statewide shutdown, Centro's ridership declined by 55%, a major hit to the system, but still far less than what occurred in New York and San Francisco. It did, however, seem to struggle more over the long term, with the 2020 fiscal year seeing a 66% decrease in ridership overall. And that's just for the fixed route buses, with paratransit and special contract lines factored in, the latter of which contributes almost twice to Centro's revenue what the standard passenger lines do. The decline is even more dramatic. Ridership numbers have been trending upward since last spring, but Centro is still only serving about half the number of bus users than it was in 2019, with no expectation from the board for it to return to pre-pandemic performance within the next couple of years. It is important to recognize, though, that Centro was already experiencing declining ridership prior to the shutdown. Centro is highly dependent on state and federal subsidies for operations, and funding issues in 2011 led to route cuts and a fare hike that the organization never fully recovered from. Centro was quick to waive its bus fare at the start of the pandemic in order to minimize commuting barriers for essential workers. At that time, the organization announced that it expected to fully maintain its regular service level. As the severity of the COVID-19 crisis set in, Centro was forced to reverse course, suspending several of its lines and switching to a reduced frequency bus schedule just a few weeks later. By August, all buses had been outfitted with protective services, and electronic fare collection launched in July of the next year. Still, Centro yo-yoed every few months between cutting its less used routes, often the ones connecting small towns to the city, and later reintroducing them. Similarly, the frequency of service has been modified multiple times. This is due not just to low ridership, but because of the short staffing of essential workers. Throughout the pandemic, the system has routinely been operating about 40 drivers below necessary service level requirements, partly due to absences from COVID-19, but long-term from low application rates. Most recently, Centra was planning to universally reduce its fares, but simultaneously waive its policy that allows for free transfer between buses, stating that only 20% of its users need to make transfers to reach their destination. While Centra's buses are the sole mode of public transportation available in the metropolitan area, the city of Syracuse reintroduced its bike share program in September of last year in an effort to promote alternatives to car travel. The program initially launched in late 2019, but was suspended when the bike provider permanently ceased operations due to COVID. With the relaunch of the bike share and addition of e-scooters, the city hopes to increase non-vehicular commuting and is offering cost waivers to low-income users. In 2015, Syracuse was found by one nonpartisan think tank to have the highest concentration of African American and Latinx residents living in poverty in the 100th largest MSAs. Another study shows that between 2009 and 2019, the Syracuse metropolitan area was among the worst performers nationally in overall job growth, racial inclusion, and geographic inclusion. In 2018, a survey conducted internally by Centro showed that the majority of respondents on 19 out of 21 bus lines self-identified as being low income, a person of color, or both. 66% of all respondents said their primary use of the bus was commuting to a job. All of these figures become incredibly important in weighing the impact of Center's response to the pandemic. In an MSA where in 2015, 78% of commuters drove to work alone, it becomes dangerously easy to marginalize the relatively small number of transit-dependent individuals stranded in a city of drivers. Pre-pandemic, bus frequency was identified across multiple local transit studies as the biggest concern to Centro riders, especially limited service at night and on weekends. Transit access within the suburbs, particularly those north of the city, has also been noted as a major challenge to those needing to commute into the city for work. The recurring fluctuation of Centro's bus schedules in the wake of COVID has undoubtedly exacerbated these concerns. Further, the impending elimination of free bus transfer is likely to add a cost burden to the people who require more than one bus trip to reach their workplace. The SMTC's task of providing accessible services will likely become more strained in the future as the residential population continues to sprawl outward, but the overall population remains stagnant. Not to mention the pandemic relief sources that are currently fueling Centro operations will at some point stop paying out. Upcoming major transportation projects, however, may offer an opportunity to correct insufficient transportation infrastructure that has isolated low-income communities spatially and economically. By removing the viaduct section of the Interstate 81, Syracuse will soon rebuild an at-grade street network called the Community Grid in the hopes of increasing economic development, walkability, and public green space. A second transportation project, still in its planning stage, is the addition of 2 bus rapid transit lines along the most heavily traveled corridors in the region. Not only is significant job growth anticipated in the corridors over the next 30 years, but 50% of the city's population lives among them, potentially giving many city residents without vehicles improved access to job opportunities.
Our survey respondents for Syracuse, New York varied in what type of industries they worked, with the majority of our respondents coming from educational services. Prior to the pandemic, none of our survey respondents for Syracuse, New York worked from home. However, during the pandemic, we had 50% of them working from home and around 40% of them not working from home. Someone indicated that they switched jobs, which did impact their answer. Currently, most of our survey respondents are not working from home, with 20% of them working hybrid and 20 of them still working from home. Our average commute time in Syracuse, New York was between 0 and 20 minutes, following with 20 to 30 minutes, and then 45 to 50. Just like San Francisco, all of our survey respondents for Syracuse, New York indicated that they used a personal vehicle as their mode of transportation for commuting. When asked whether or not individuals changed jobs in Syracuse, a majority, about 70% of our respondents said yes. We had someone who changed jobs, but within the same organization, someone who moved from Long Island to Syracuse, working in finance previously, but still working in the finance industry, and another person who graduated from college and transitioned from their part-time job to a full-time job following their graduation. Unfortunately, we are unable to conduct interviews with Syracuse survey respondents.
Based on our findings regarding the pandemic's economic and transit-related impact on the Syracuse area, we'd like to offer some policy recommendations that may help Centro and the SMTC deal with the current challenges they are faced with and perhaps become more resilient to crises like COVID-19 in the future. One of the greatest obstacles to maintaining pre-pandemic service levels, for example, has been the staffing of bus drivers. Centro should continue its current hiring push and the streamlining of training programs by targeting recruitment efforts in underemployed communities, and do so in close communication with job equity-focused organizations like the Onondaga Citizens League. In instances where bus cuts are unavoidable due to staffing deficits or otherwise, Centro could work with the city government as well as local nonprofits to plan for short-term support for commuters who unexpectedly find themselves with no way to work. This could take the form of temporary rideshare vouchers or a sort of triage commuter shuttle, the need for the latter having been demonstrated by the efforts of a nonprofit called Providence Services, whose Ride to Work program ran for several years, but recently ceased operations due to its own driver shortage and the rising cost of gas. In a 2021 study with the New York State Department of Transportation, the SMTC determined that the city's current bike infrastructure was moderately used, but had the capacity to accommodate additional traffic. The MPO should leverage this by partnering with major employers situated near existing bikeways to develop bike-to-work incentives. If additional lanes become available in the future, as is currently proposed under the Community Grid Plan, the city's new bike and e-scooter program should be expanded in relation. While encouraging more active and inexpensive commuting methods is ideal, the most impactful strategies in the short term will be the ones that work with the prevailing car culture of Syracuse. We recommend a public-private partnership wherein the city can pursue tax breaks for TNC drivers who participate in programs that get low-income employees to work. Another alternative is for a municipal Wheels to Work program that assists low-income workers who don't have transit access fund the purchase and maintenance of a personal vehicle for commuting purposes. We offer these suggestions with the caveat that funding such projects is very difficult for a small and heavily subsidized transit authority like Centro. For that reason, the above solutions will likely need to be paired with revenue-producing ones, such as monetizing the currently free circulator bus, which runs in loops through the downtown core, and seeking out additional special contract lines, such as that which runs for the state fair, to both facilitate local tourism and events and diversify Centro's revenue stream. Long term, we believe one of the best things Centro and the SMTC can do to fortify itself against major disruptions like COVID is to learn from local coalition approaches used elsewhere. Special interest groups like the Syracuse Onondaga Food Systems Alliance and the Manufacturers Association of Central New York both leveraged their networks to minimize industry losses when the pandemic hit. The SMTC could similarly build a coalition of municipal, planning, and community leaders to quickly tap into when emergencies demand it. Additionally, transit-oriented development should become a top priority for city developers, especially as new opportunities emerge with the Interstate 81 project and the future of bus rapid transit. By thoughtfully coordinating transit stops with jobs and retail storefronts, especially with the region's most struggling industries prioritized, Syracuse can improve employment access, create industry-specific growth initiatives, such as recruiting workers in the hard-hit arts sector to participate in streetscaping, and combat the developmental sprawl that is increasingly straining its transit system. It should, however, include within this a community benefits agreement and a move towards equity rather than gentrification. As our last policy recommendation for Syracuse, We'd like to suggest increasing public access to data collected by Centro and the SMTC. Though we suspect that this may be a result of having fewer resources to devote to analyzing and disseminating information compared to larger staffed planning offices in New York and San Francisco, putting the effort into doing so could produce creative solutions to Centro's problems.